Welcome to Maarifa na Taarifa na Kasisi. Mada ya leo ni kuhusu losing my religion, based on an article that was written 4 years ago by Christine Mungai. Karibu. This is KWR, telling our story together. Sometimes we may need, as a church, to learn from our friends who sometimes critique the way the church has carried itself and how faith has been presented to our people. And today, I want to share an article that was actually shared with me by a friend of mine very recently. And the title of the article is Losing My Religion, the Cross, the Lynching Tree, and Kenya's Post-Colonial Enterprise. This is a paper that was written by a Kenyan journalist, Christine Mungai, and it was published in a magazine called The Elephant on May 31st, 2018. Karibu. As I've mentioned, we wish to speak into the fact of a spiritual journey of one who dares challenge the church and also speak into issues that have affected her faith. And this is a story of Christine Mungai, who speaks of her formative years, having been raised a Presbyterian as a child and as a teenager at the PCEA St. Andrew's Church, Nairobi. I invite you to read this paper or this piece, interrogate it just as I have, and possibly let us hold a theological debate or discussion. I have provided the link to the article here below. You'll find it offered to you so that you can also read and have your own judgment. Let me say from the onset that people like Christine are allies of the church. They are not enemies. Therefore, my discussion today, as I think through this critique, my purpose is not to fight the church, but my main purpose is to help us begin to converse with people like Christine Mungai and ask deep questions as to why this article was actually written. People like Christine has given us clues such that if we are willing to scratch beneath the surface, we may find answers to some of the questions that we have wrestled with as Christians and wonder what happens to those of us who sometimes leave the faith or are so critical of the faith. In this article, Christine Mungai problematizes the church, holiness, spirituality, liturgy, intellectual guesses in the name of theological topics or theology, power, politics, ethnicity, gender, to name but a few. Even though trained as a journalist, Christine has indeed a very good grasp of church history, of politics, of theology, and of culture. I have gleaned several overarching themes from the article that are the bedrock of my broadcast today. First of this topic, or first of this theme, is motherhood, spiritual and moral formation. Christine has written extensively about the formative role her mother played, that is, her mother, Rose Wajiko, played in her life. As Christine writes, her mother, who with all purpose and intention raised her with the hope to make her, that is Christine, as she says it and as she puts it, a dignified mini adult in the church. Looming in the background of this spiritual and moral formation was her largely irreligious father. Of course, this is a norm that Christine says is almost universal in our spiritual spaces in Kenya. Many of us can definitely relate or identify with the role mothers have played in our early spiritual and moral formation, while fathers sometimes have remained detached or completely absent from that space. How has this impacted our Christian formation, I wonder, and the worldview that we hold today? Well, we can learn a few things from Christine Mungai and how that affected her in that spiritual journey, and also pick up a few, nuggets that can help us along the journey as we continue speaking to our young people and as we also wrestle with our own faith and formation. In Christine's article, we learn how teenage resentment and maternal anxieties resulted into a crisis at home, something that she calls a domestic strife. Which brings me to the second theme of that article. That is a youthful quest for meaning and an attempt to find spiritual home in Pentecostalism. We all, at some point in our lives, have definitely struggled in some ways as we seek meaning, relevance, and independence. Christine was not different. She did not only have to wrestle with her overbearing mother, as she puts it, but she also became increasingly uncomfortable with Presbyterianism and its heritage of Mutaratara, based on the colonial structures of the old Presbyterianism that was introduced to Kenya through the Scottish missionaries. The discomfort that she had, that is Christine, added psychic and moral confusion to her as a teenager, and therefore a genuine quest for meaning and a desire to find her own voice in her early years became a fertile ground for what many of our parents possibly may have termed as rebelliousness. I'm sure many can relate with that fact, that when you are out there trying to seek meaning, trying to find your own voice, trying to find your own independence, you seemed or appeared, or I appeared, as a rebel to my parents and to those that were older than us, and particularly those that led us in the church. In the midst of this quest, Christine says that she met what she refers to as some cool kids whose influence led her to join the Nairobi Pentecostal Church. In her own words, the youth fellowship at NPC became her fortress, and bridled energy and chaotic emotionality of Pentecostal service was actually enchanting to her. In the youth fellowship at MPC, Christine found her new spiritual home. It actually compensated that which she lacked and yearned for at PCEA St. Andrews. In the fellowship that is at NPC, she found her voice, as she says. The youth group affirmed who she was, and quickly, earning her respect, Christine took up leadership role. Like most of us, when you begin or when you get into a group that affirms who you are and that allows you the independence and latitude, definitely you warm up towards that group. It was no different with Christine. So she became instrumental in organizing concerts, youth camps, picnics, movies, praise and worship, missions, and on several occasions she was allowed to preach, something possibly she did not have the opportunity to do at St. Andrews. In all honesty, Christine says that church became fun. Unfortunately, or fortunately, loss of her mother's supervisory role and Christine's newfound independence and participation at NPC that came up with her new commitment, that deeply upset her mother. The new spiritual commitments upset her mother, who truly undesired and genuinely so wanted her to grow a Presbyterian. Despite the increased conflict at home, Christine says that the Pentecostal church became a sanctuary, the place where she grew up, developed her own personality, and made deep and meaningful friendships. In essence, the Mutaratara failed to connect with Christine at that deep and personal level. I also assume that we are being invited in this paper by Christine Mungai to ask questions of why her mother's Mutaratara or her mother's Mutaratara's church suffered such disconnect with some of its young members. Is this something that modern day churches in Kenya, particularly the mainstream churches, are suffering from? Is the disconnect still real? It is possible that the Mutaratara Church, which by the way is my own church, that is PCEA, had not separated itself from the colonial baggage, and for that reason, not able to independently seek out ways of connecting with the youth. This is just an assumption that I'm making. But the issue that Christine is dealing with is not as simple as it may seem. And she does not leave her readers without a pointer as to the direction of our conversation. So as you're reading the paper, I invite you not to think that it is about Mutaratara and all that. The paper has a deeper quest that we'll continue looking at and drives me to my other theme that I've gleaned from this paper. In her domestic strife, that is the tension at home, that is domestic strife at her Kenyan home, she sees it as a microcosm of the national tension and conflict in the universal space in Kenya. What really forced me to think hard on what Christine intended to communicate in the article that I'm discussing today is how she ties the local or domestic strife, that is mother-daughter tension, to the context of a country whose religious life had always been animated, as she says, and as she puts it, by its relationship with power. So, after giving us a snapshot of the history of the Presbyterian Church of East Africa and its colonial connections, Christine convincingly shows how her experience at home was a microcosm of the 1980s and 1990s national tension. As she writes, this is a time when Kenya's Christian institutions were undergoing a profound change, a national context whose religious life had always been animated by its relationship with power. This, of course, most of us can remember, is a time period when Kenyans experienced years of state repression, surveillance, and detention, and we know of many even to this date, who suffered. Some of them have already gone to be with the Lord, but they did suffer under presidency of Moi. Just as some form of Christianity was a colonial project in most of Africa, the post-colonial denominations, such as the Roman Catholic Church, the Anglican, the Presbyterian, which at the time, that is 1980s and 1990s, accounted for 70% of Christian congregations. This is at the time when Daniel Arap Moi became Kenya's second president in 1978. What is interesting is how Christine Mungai ties that, the mainstream denominations with their proximity to power and their continued of uncritical relationship with the government, even after independence. Like her mother at PCES St. Andrews, she says these denominations occupied a place of privilege and prestige. These are denominations that chose to remain firmly pro-establishment, preferring to keep out of politics and focusing on providing social services for the sake of prosperity and national unity. Christine opines that the National Council of Churches of Kenya, that is NCCK, in 1978, it launched a theological study of the newly installed president's political philosophy of Nyayo, of peace, love, and unity, with the intention, according to Christine, to get the Nyayo philosophy incorporated into religious education in schools and also among congregations. Unfortunately, despite its proximity to power, NCCK's leadership and the ethnicity makeup of the partnering churches, that is Presbyterians, Anglicans, and so forth, threatened President Moi's power. NCCK's potency to unite notwithstanding, ethnicity threatened the national fabric. So increasingly, this isolated Moi, and he encouraged several Pentecostal and evangelical congregations to form what is called, or was called, I don't know whether it's still surviving, Evangelical Fellowship of Kenya. This, of course, was not meant to help in any way, but rather it was meant to counter and disempower the mainstream denominations for so long that had enjoyed the vestiges of colonial power. As they got alienated from power, the likes of Muge, Joya, Dr. Gitare, the late Dingi Mwananzeki, late Bishop Okuru, among others, broke loose. On the other hand, congregations such as African Inland Church, AIC, and the Reformed Church of East Africa, the Kenya Assemblies of God, and African Gospel Church, they all became part of the Evangelical Fellowship. Interestingly, according to Christine Mungai, the Evangelical Fellowship of Kenya saw Moi as the anointed one of God. And you shall see how this ties into the final play into and how it played out into the Kibaki's reign, and how this also affected the way Christine perceived Christianity and her faith, and how her faith changed. Because underlying this seemingly denominational fault line were more sinister political and ethnic features. Prosperity gospel and privatization of personal faith found its home in the new dispensation of the Evangelical Fellowship, which is the other theme that we can glean from Christine paper. With the new alignment, prosperity gospel, as we have seen, exploded in the Kenyan spiritual spaces. And this also affected the space in which Christine was already a member. She was a member of, remember, of the of the Nairobi Pentecostal Church, where her mother continued being a member at St. Andrew's Church, which is a Presbyterian church. This prosperity gospel emphasized personal relationship with Jesus and personal holiness. Even though when you read Christian paper, this seems as though it was a new thing, I don't think it was, at least in my estimation, because we do know that the East Africa Revival Fellowship occupied the same space, the space of preaching personal relationship with Jesus and personal holiness. And this had started way back in 1936 during the colonial period, when the East African Revival movement broke away from the colonial connections of Christianity. A discussion for another day. But what is new, though, is that the prosperity gospel invited churchgoers to individually claim their miracles and blessings directly from God. In the same breath, the prosperity gospel completely ignored or even blamed the devil for the crumbling economic and social structures. Disintegration of social cohesion and economic disempowerment were all, according to the prosperity gospel, a mark of a cursed society. As the social and political foundations collapsed during President Moi's reign, Pentecostalism invited people to practice their personal faith. And materialism was interpreted as a divine sign or a mark of acceptance by God. So, how does it tie back to Christine, you may ask? She offers yet another gem, that is, political consciousness and intellectual maturity, which has a moral angle to it. As she grew older, Christine became more politically conscious and intellectually mature. Of course, now she's grown to become a young adult at the university. Consequently, her faith became a source of deep internal strife. The conflict was not only now at home and on the national scale, the conflict became internal. This was more or less informed by the already entrenched interpretations of Scripture in the spaces that were both found in Pentecostalism and mainstream denominations. This is the interpretation that seemed to be obsessed, according to Christine, with meticulous sexual policing. In her own words, Christine increasingly became uncomfortable with biblical interpretations and preaching that targeted girls and women while blaming them for men's moral failure. And this again is not new. It is even found in our society to this day, where, men are usually given that clean slate, and any moral failure on a man is blamed either, it's usually blamed on a woman. And if you remember, not too long ago, we had My Dress, My Choice. It was coming from that space where women were feeling like men were determining how they should dress and whom they should love and whom they should marry, instead of the woman herself making those choices. As a young adult, she noticed that the church and her church, that is Nairobi Pentecostal Church, had transformed itself into a place where women, according to her, this is a direct quotation from her, a place where women learned, practiced, refined their marriageability, And she quips, one of the major traits of wifeability was the maintenance of the purity, in quotes, in a male and a female relationship. The meticulous sexual policing over girls gave boys, according to Christine, and definitely I tend to agree, as well as men, an aura of moral power over women. And perhaps, she says, it wasn't incidental that many of our fathers, according to her, were disinterested in the church except when they were looking for a good woman to marry. And we all of us agree that men always, teased each other by saying that if you want to find a good woman or a good wife, go to the church. Don't go to the club. You come party with them in the club, but if you want a good wife, go to the church. And this is what Christine was talking about, that she became increasingly uncomfortable as she matured politically and intellectually and was able to critique the system and the faith. Men in those spaces at the church and even in other spaces continued to adjudicate whether the girl had adequately maintained the collective purity of the relationship or had fallen short of glory of God. You don't need to look far. You just need to listen to some of our pastors and even our men in the church and their language and how they speak of morality. It's almost always like the women are the problem. The girl child is the problem when it comes to moral decisions, where male have to make those moral decisions. Well, I know this is not universal, but definitely it impacts how we view women and how we relate with them and how we see them and how we interpret their own actions in our social spaces, as it were in the church. So the domestic strife of our teenager years now was playing out on a national scale or at a national scale as the church increasingly became a moral police over the woman's body and life choices. So what she's driving at is that you look at the domestic strife, that local space, and you begin to connect the dots, and you'll find that what is happening at the local was actually playing out at the national level at different stages and at different levels of society. Yet, the nation's political and ethnic strife continued unabated. Just like in the Kenyan home, Kenya, she says, and this is another theme that we draw from the paper, is a country where ethnicity is everything. And this is something that she's observing as she's growing up, as she's maturing, both in faith, intellectually, and politically. In a span of very few years, Christine's faith go full cycle, circling back to her personal faith and the loss of it. But we shall see, I'm not saying that she lost her faith, but we shall see how that faith transforms as she matures in every way possible. In those intense days, then Mwai Kibaki's presidency happened, changing the Kenyans' political mood to that of joy and optimism. And we all know how we felt when Kibaki came into power. It not only gave Kenyans hope in general, but Christine says, this is what Christine says about her own mother, to see that she's never leaving that domestic space, even as she converses with us on a national scale. She says, Kibaki's first swearing-in ceremony was the first, and I believe the last, political meeting my mother attended in her life. She walked from our home in South B to Uhuru Park to join the celebratory throng and watch a new democratic government take power. What we see is that the mother-daughter conflict mutated from being a dispute over denomination or over the body now into our politics. Kibaki's consolidation of power came swiftly. The consolidation happened around his Kikuyu elite, which, according to Christine, seemed to betray the multi-ethnic and popular mandate that he had received and had brought him to power. At that national level, at least among the Kikuyus, just like in the days of Moi, Christians who are Kikuyus now saw Kibaki's presidency as anointed by God, and Kibaki became God's anointed. The disagreement at home revolved around the same national tension. Christine says, at home, I would constantly challenge my mother on those kinds of declaration, that is, Kibaki is, God's anointed. My voice shrill, my manner emphatic. How do we know that whoever is in power is God's anointed? What is godly about chauvinism? Are we now saying that Anglo-leasing is the will of God? She would only warily listen to me and wave me off. 5 years later, unfortunately, in the aftermath of the disputed 2007 election and the ensuing brutal violence, while watching all that, Christine says, watching in horror the smoldering remains of a church in Kiambaa, where a mob shot dozens of people in a church, blocked the door with a mattress, and set the sanctuary on fire. As the smoke billowed on the television screen, my mother turned to me and calmly said the most cutting words she had ever said to me. Do you think that when they come for you, they will ask you who you voted for? Kenya, a nation that claimed Christianity as its heritage, had not changed. Kenya was a country where your ethnicity was everything, the difference between life and death. And Christine says, personal holiness that people like herself were taught to aspire to as a mark of the kingdom would not save her from political system that was so depraved and unjust. The same Christian faith could not stop her from being summarily executed for having the wrong name. Personal faith and spirituality was not going to save any woman's body. Witnessing Kiambaa, Christine added, 30 people died that day, and so did my faith. She would spend the next 8 years of her life vaguely describing herself as an agnostic. An agnostic is the one who does not deny the existence of God, but cannot prove it. They cannot deny the existence, neither can they prove it. So she says, describing herself as agnostic, spiritual but not religious, and generally actually avoiding matters of faith. This is Christine, who has evolved from the teenage that rejected Presbyterianism to become Pentecostal, and she found meaning, she found friendship, she found love, she found acceptance, or in those Pentecostal spaces, and over the years came to this conclusion. the confusion, the internal strife was real. I know some of us may want to over-spiritualize this matter and say, oh, wow, possibly some will even dismiss it as the work of the enemy, the work of the devil, but I think we need to pause and ask ourselves serious questions when we read such powerful and candid testimony. She questioned how, this is Christine now, she questioned how a self-respecting and political conscious African can associate with Christianity. And I invite you now to listen to or to watch my other video that I did on the difference between African Christianity and Western Christianity, and why I still believe that even though we wrestle with these issues, it does not mean that Christianity is wrong, and it does not mean that Christianity is not my religion, and that if I go back to that other religion, which I don't know which one it is, that exists today, that I might find a better space. Western Christianity, in its form, and as it had evolved as either, the mainstream denominations or Pentecostalism in Kenya, led Christine to this point. She wondered how she could continue calling herself a Christian. But is hope lost then? No. And Christine does not leave us hopeless. She does not leave us at a space where what do we do then? She does offer us a solution, and particularly on what she calls the prophetic faith. And she is so dismissive of the priests and pastors who are too insensitive to injustices, who have this discomfort with social protest or real reform because it might lead to a loss of their social capital. She has no patience with priests and pastors who nurture humility, patience, and goodwill in their congregations in order to integrate them into a culture as productive and royal citizens. She lacks patience, and she does not hide it, of pastors and priests who uncritically embrace society's unjust structures, especially the capitalism economy that has its colonial logic intact, and the obsession with the morals and manners, reflecting on the non-confrontation stance of the priest. On the other hand, hope can be found in the radical reform of a prophet. The prophet is the one who is never neutral in the face of oppression. When they read scriptures, they don't take a so-called objective stance. When they face drought, hunger, abuse, violence, oppression, a prophet takes a stand. The prophet does not want to hear both sides, does not want to be fair and balanced, cannot be objective, so she says. And this fired me up because this is what I believe. And the church for far too long, we have stayed put in our spaces. We have protected those spaces. We cannot speak out. We want to nurture, timid Christians. We don't want confrontation. We don't want to charge out and say, this is wrong. We don't want to become John, who said, you know what? Herod, you have taken your brother's wife. The prophet is on the side of justice. And Christine says it is time for Kenyan Christians to live out their ministry for those caught up in the other side, on the other side of power today, at least for the least of these. And in the words of one of my greatest, theological heroes, James Cone, We cannot find liberating joy in the cross by spiritualizing it, by taking away its message of justice in the midst of powerlessness, suffering, and death. The cross must have a meaning. As a locus of divine revelation, is not good news for the powerful, for those who are comfortable with the way things are, for anyone whose understanding of religion is aligned with power. The cross must mean something to us, not materialism, not safe spaces, but taking a stand and knowing that God always sides with the poor, with the oppressed, with those that are served unjustly, and so forth. What is powerful, at least in my opinion, in this article, is that Christine Mungai finds solutions in radical Christianity. She does not run away from Christianity. And she does, even though the title of her article is Losing My Religion, in essence, she does not, well, when you read it, she does not lose her faith. She finds solutions in radical Christianity. Christianity of the Bible, Christianity of the Old Testament prophet, Christianity of the New Testament, where Jesus could not stand. Some of these characters that today we praise and we honor. To digress a little bit, I've heard people preach about the gown that Jesus wore, that it was purple and therefore he was a king. And therefore, and that takes a trajectory of materialism that is abhorring. Radical Christianity brings change, brings joy. It serves and connects even where there is strife, whether domestic or national. But radical Christianity does not shy away from the problems of society. Neither does it take side with the powerful and those that seems to be doing well. Ni hayo tu kwa taarifa na maarifa na kasisi. Asante. If you find this video useful and this message helpful, kindly don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And the link to the article is provided here below. I also invite you to join me in listening to KWR. This is a daily broadcast with music from Africa and other places, and preachings from my friends, as well as teachings like these ones. And when you listen to my radio, you'll be blessed as I will also be blessed. As for now, may the Lord bless you. May the Lord keep you. Until next time, bye-bye and shalom.